So the idea then is to give an account of a single process of development that begins on the side of nature and the evolution of more complex capacities to sense, think, and act, and that culminates in history and the development of ideas of beauty, truth, and goodness, where we can see philosophy as Peirce's idea of the practice of the normative sciences, these being aesthetics, logic, and ethics. And so then philosophy becomes the self-conscious motor for that developmental process. So that's the big picture idea. Now, ultimately, this comes out of work that I completed here. This is my book. It was just published. The proximal aim then is to use modal logic to build a common language and framework for thinking about what it is to be a rational animal, a framework for philosophers and scientists. The distal aim is to use this semantics to theorize about the nature of discursive cognition, that is self-governing cognition, the idea of rational cognition as being autonomy, self-government. So to use this semantics to think about what rationality is in human beings. So you could see it as an attempt to use the science of logic as an inroad toward a philosophy of nature and spirit. That's the broad picture. So this summarizes the account and then outlines ongoing work. Okay, so I'm going to do this fairly quickly. This material is up here so that in the Q&A, if people are interested, we could talk about it in detail. But I just want to give the sense of how the semantics works as model theoretic involving possible worlds and plans of action, because these are the extensions that I see characterizing the word world and world word relations corresponding to sensation and volition. So it's just part of, its root is just a possible world semantics, just the set theoretic operations on sets of possible worlds that allow you to get Boolean logic. So we talk a possible world as a maximally determinate state of affairs. We take an intentional hyperplan as a maximally determinate plan of action. So it's maximally determinate in the sense for every agent, for every circumstance, and for every action open to that agent or that circumstance, the plan as a hyperplan specifies what that agent does. So it does it for every agent then. Okay, but deontic modality distinguishes a strong and a weak modal force. There's what ought to be and what's permitted. Shared intentional modal operators don't distinguish that distinction, don't have that distinction in modal force. As a result, we need a more fine-grained notion of choice to characterize the hyperplans for deontic cognition. So here's the root idea. And this was actually, from what I can tell, independently developed at least 3 times. First by Sellers in the 60s and 70s, then by Gibbard in 2003 in his book on Thinking How to Live, and then again by Jamie Dreyer. And it's not clear to me that either of these people knew that the other ones had developed it. My own account is in terms of single-mindedness. They all speak of preference as the one attitude, but I think single-mindedness is a better way of thinking about it. So an agent chooses single-mindedly just in case she rejects every choice incompatible with that action. And I'll speak about what rejection means a little bit later. So to think that one ought to attend the talk is to give expression to a plan where one chooses single-mindedly to do so by rejecting everything incompatible with it. Now, I think of rejection as a primitive, affective, practical stance. I'll mention the way I think about it as being embodied in structures and transperspectival neural mirroring and the exercise of the reactive attitudes. But for now, think of it as just a primitive attitude. So this notion of rejection is not the kind of thing that a wolf does when it picks an antelope off from the herd. So the wolf is, in a sense, rejecting incompatible alternatives, but it's not doing that on the basis of binding itself to a course of action by not letting itself choose to do something different. And you can see this because if a more promising prey should appear, the wolf will change course. But when I think I ought to come to the lecture and my inclinations impel me to do something different, insofar as I do what I think I ought, I bind myself to that course of action by not allowing my inclinations to interfere with what I've settled on doing. Okay, so that gives you the strong modal force of obligation and forbiddance. You get permission then defined in terms of single-mindedness. And this is one of the ways where I go beyond Sellers and Gibbard and Schroeder, Dreyer, by giving this definition. So for an agent that can choose single-mindedly, she chooses indifferently just in case there's some action incompatible with it, such that she could have undertaken it without changing any of her single-minded decisions. So when I think I ought to come to the lecture and that I'm permitted to sit in the front and the back, I choose indifferently between those two options in the sense that they both satisfy my single-minded decision to attend the lecture. And in that case, then I reject rejecting each of these incompatible alternatives. Okay, so then we just have a deontic hyperplan. It's like an intentional hyperplan, but we exhaust the choices in terms of single-mindedness and indifference. And then a deontic intentional hyperstate is an ordered triple of a world, a deontic hyperplan, and an intentional hyperplan. And this semantics is adequate to give you descriptive mind-world sentences. We are going to the talk. Singular and plural intentional world-mind sentences. I or we shall go to the talk. And prescriptive world-mind sentences. One ought or may or ought not go to the talk. And it's a view on what shared intentional and deontic cognition are alike in that they involve this transposition of our practical rationality across perspectives. So then this is just the definitions for characterizing different mental states sufficient to get Boolean logic with just the set theoretic operations that people are familiar with possible world semantics. And again, we can go over this in the discussion if people want to talk about it. Okay, so it's fully compositional. You can introduce quantifiers as well. I just published an essay looking at quantification. And it gives an intuitive gloss on rational thought and agency as a kind of self-government, a kind of practical self-government. It's mediated by an ability to bind oneself to a course of action by rejecting classes of choice that are incompatible with it. And the idea is it develops out of a capacity to share intentions, insofar as in both cases of the mental states that are modeled by these hyperplans, you've got the transposition of a point of view across perspectives. But in the case of the deontic operators, you need this more fine-grained notion of choice. So you can see deontic cognition as a kind of more conceptually sophisticated sort of practical rationality that's already there in shared intentionality. Okay, so the idea then is that shared intentionality and deontic cognition are species of a genus of practical rationality. And now Sellers identifies moral judgment with shared intentionality in some places. And that's not right, because if that was the case, then a claim like we ought not go to war, but we shall would be a straightforward contradiction. But there's nothing contradictory about that. We can be in situations like that. It's practically irrational. And I can specify that in virtue of which is practically irrational. There's no plan, there's no choice you can make that satisfies all the plans you've committed. But you've got to distinguish the shared intentional from the deontic more precisely than Sellers does. They're not identified, they're species of a genus. Okay, so this view makes certain predictions about what we would expect to see in human beings if it was the case that deontic cognition was a kind of more conceptually sophisticated sort of practical rationality that's present in shared intentionality. And I want to summarize some of the things that I think supports the view. So I came to the view on my own, just working through the logic. And then as I got into the science, it looked to support it. So seems to me this is the kind of thing that suggests that there is a science of logic that can lead you into a philosophy of nature. Okay, so from about 9 months of age, human infants show a proclivity to share affective mental states with caregivers. By the beginning of the second year, this is developed into a capacity to share practical mental states with other kids and with caregivers. By the beginning of the third year, it develops into an ability to track fairly subtle distinctions in normative statuses, things like commitment and entitlement, the distinction between conventions and moral rules, and in some cases, even higher order entitlements, like when one kid gives a toy to another to play with, recognizing that they then are entitled to do something in virtue of the fact that they've been given that toy by the one who owns it. This all develops before reliable passing of false belief tests at about age 4. So it looks like there's a kind of practical cognition that is less complex than belief state attribution, or we might think of as theoretical cognition of other minds, and where the deontic develops out of or on top of the shared intentional. Okay, so I think that insofar as single-mindedness has a realization in the human body, it's going to be something like higher order executive processing and self-control. And then if it was the case that shared intentionality and deontic cognition involve this trans-perspective exercise of practical rationality, you would expect to see things like our motor representation complex mirroring that of other people as we do things together. And as a matter of fact, that's what we do see. Now, I think that deontic cognition involves more than just neural mirroring. I mean, that's not even sufficient for shared intentionality. I think of deontic cognition as involving a whole suite of reactive attitudes, what Strawson calls reactive attitudes, what used to be called the moral sentiments, as an exercise of not only putting myself practically into your point of view, but adopting a sort of sympathetic or affective stance with regard to yours. So here's Butterfield discussing neural mirroring. Much coordination of joint action appears to involve not fully distinguishing others' actions from your own. In each case, coordination involves motor or task representations of actions, tasks, or goals that relate primarily to another's part in the joint action. This is not a matter of representing another's goals or plans as an observer. That is, it's not an exercise of theoretical cognition, of representational cognition. It's a matter of preparing actions and representing tasks that she will perform in ways that would also be appropriate if it were you, not her, who was about to perform them. That is, it's an exercise of practical cognition. Okay, so Tomasello has this account of the development of human cognition on the basis of a two-stage development in shared intentionality, from joint to collective intentionality. And I see heads nodding here. There's also a couple of people yawning. I won't point them out, but for those of the heads that are yawning, I figure that that most of us are familiar with this stuff. So again, I'm gonna go fairly quickly here. So we have it joint intentionality, small groups of individuals that are sharing intentionality over proximally, spatio-temporally proximate tasks. But it's with collective intentionality and large cultural traditions that you get the idea of the true and the moral as what applies to everybody. So Tomasello thinks here's where you've got human thinking properly so called. Yeah, and then Schmidt and Riccozzi have this review article where at the end of it, looking at the development of norm psychology, at the end of it, they propose one picture that's worth being explored more systematically in future research is that while humans and other species, notably primates, share basic forms of individual intentionality and the corresponding natural norms of correctness and success, uniquely human forms of norm psychology and uniquely human forms of shared intentionality develop in close tandem and early ontogeny, the former building on and growing out of the latter. So my claim is that's exactly what the modal logic would suggest, given the need to distinguish the strong and the weak modal forces for deontic modality. So here's Tomasello's view. So here you have the development. So on the right-hand side, you've got the development of different stages of capacities for human beings. And then on the left, we have characterizations of the kinds of things that are available at that stage. So he thinks from individual intentionality, we get joint and then collective intentionality. And then human cognition builds on top of that. So what I argue in my book is that this is a more precise account. And Tomasello, in A Natural History of Human Thinking, explicitly says he's open to the possibility that there might be more stages that need to be individuated here. So one way you can think about what I'm doing is trying to individuate more fine-grained stages. So the idea is that it's not that collective intentionality gets us human thinking and linguistic culture by itself, but rather what we need is deontic cognition as responsiveness to reasons. So it's only insofar as I can recognize what I ought to do and say that I can be characterized as engaging in the kind of cognition that's discursive, understood as autonomous. Okay. So, and it turns out practices of positive and negative reinforcement suffice, exercised through shared intentionality, suffice for there to be norms instituted in a community concerning what's right and wrong, even if no one is yet able to think about what's right and wrong in the sense of cognition that comes with single-mindedness. So just acting on intentions to stick beat and flock tend, doing different kinds of things, suffice to make it the case that there are things that are going to be counted as appropriate and not in a community. Even though, and so in particular, things like a system of vocal communication, maybe a system of verbal communication could be instituted in a community of hominids, even if none of them were aware that that's what they were doing in the sense of awareness that involves rational cognition. Okay, so here's the idea then. It's possible that a community of collectively intentional hominids might come to shape the linguistic norms of a community such that there were right and wrong things to do or say, including modes of communication that are instituted by these norms, even though none of them knew what they were doing in the sense of knowing that involves single-minded self-government when the process began. So there's this debate between Brandom and McDowell about whether or not logic is necessary for reason mongering. I've got a view here. I think it's not logic that makes the difference. It's single-mindedness exercised in a linguistic community that's got a language strong enough to contain its own meta-language. But I don't think Bob actually made it to the talk, so I'm going to skip this then. If you're there, Bob, I'm sorry. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit. So I said at the beginning I was going to look at the distinction between proof theoretic and model theoretic semantics is a way of resuscitating the old comprehension or connotation and extension or denotation distinction. And this is sort of, it's one of these weird things that philosophers today don't, I think, collectively adequately appreciate. So we have all this work on hyper-intentional logics that, I mean, we saw it discussed in Bob's talk, actually, the idea that you might need impossible worlds to make sense of some things, or that we might have to posit a logic of essences to make sense of such things. Now, the reason that we're in this position is because Carnap took the old Leibnizian term intention and used it as an ersatz for Frege's notion of sense in meaning and necessity. And Carnap's explicit in meaning and necessity, that he doesn't think his notion of intention is going to do all of the work that these older notions of comprehension or intention did. But for his purposes, that's fine, because it gives him an algebraically tractable notion of meaning sufficient for necessity and possibility. And so he takes intentions as functions from state descriptions to extensions. And state descriptions are just maximally determinate states of affairs. They're just, for every atomic sentence or its negation, either the atomic sentence or its negation is in that state description. So that's just I mean, he's basically got possible worlds. He doesn't have the accessibility relation. So he's not able to specify which of C.I. Lewis's modal axioms hold. That was one of the insights of Kripke's possible world semantics. But even in meaning and necessity, Carnap's got this notion of a possible world. So today we have all this trouble with hyper-intentional semantics. We think we have to go hyper-intentional. That's just evidence that the notion of intention as a function from a world or a state description to an extension isn't adequate to characterize this older notion of supposition or comprehension or content or connotation. So intuitively, the distinction is between the objects that are referred to by a term and concept containment. So the example that Kant gives is the difference between firs, lindens, and pines being in the extension of tree, whereas the term or the concept tree is part of the concept fir, linden, and pine. So it's a difference between a word-world relation and a word-word relation. And I think that it's much better, rather than trying to build a notion of comprehension or intention inside model theory, we should use model theory and proof theory to build the old notion of comprehension and extension with these systems. I think there's a way of seeing 20th century logic and its division into these two camps is implicitly tracking this old distinction. Okay, so the idea then is that model theory with possible worlds and plans of actions gives us the two kinds of word-world extensional or denotational relations. And then proof theory with interlinguistic rules of inference gives us a notion of comprehension or connotation. Okay, but if that's right, then it would seem to be the case. I've done all this stuff in model theory. If that's right, it would seem to be the case that there would be things in proof theory that would help make sense of this picture. So if I've got something that's coherent here, it ought to be the case that there are things that we can see in proof theory that can shed light on this account of discursive cognition in the way that I've argued we can with model theory. So what I want to do is I want to look at two cases. So I want to look at Stephanie Dock's metalinguistic account of Seller's notion of deontic modality. She's recently published this essay going against the grain of, I don't know, like 60 years of scholarship on Seller's views on deontic modality that I think is really interesting. And I'm going to argue that it can be seen as a proof theoretic rendition of what Sellers is up to, and that instead of being in tension with the model theoretic account that I've given that is more standard, it's actually compatible once we see comprehension and extension as being complementary in terms of proof theory and model theory. And then the last thing I want to do is I want to look at dialogical accounts of human rationality in bilateral semantic programs, because bilateralism is a kind of natural deduction system, so it falls on the proof theoretic side of things. So I'm going to argue that both my interpretation of Stephanie's reading of Sellers and this thing I'm going to do with bilateral semantics indicates that there is a viable notion of proof theory that can be wedded to this account of model theory that both sheds light on what it is to be one of us and supports my view that model theory and proof theory need to be seen as complementary in these ways. Okay, so it's often, the conventional reading of Sellers is that the claim that one ought to do something expresses a shared intention. That's one way of reading what I've given. My account is that it expresses something like a shared intention. It's species of a genus, but it's something like that. Stephanie argues on the basis of looking carefully at Sellers' later works that he actually undergoes a transition, and that in his later works, he gives what she calls a metalinguistic reading. That an assertion of one ought to A and C, where the ought is moral, gives expression to the metalinguistic claim that commitment to the we intention, we shall A and C, is implied by the we intention, we shall promote the general welfare. So the idea then is that the moral claim is actually expressing an implication relation between statements of shared intentions. So it's metalinguistic in that sense that it expresses what would be given in the meta language as a claim between shared intentions. So it's an indirect reading insofar as practical agency is operative in ought claims at one step removed. We infer it from this metalinguistic claim. Okay, so a little bit about proof theoretic semantics now. The system I'm using is Nassim France's Proof Theoretic Semantics, a book that was published in 2015. But very generally, in proof theory, we take the meanings of expressions to be given by their introduction and elimination rules. The introduction rules specify their role in the conclusions of inferences. Their elimination rules specify their roles in the premises of inferences. So it's an intralinguistic word-word account where we've got rules of inference that specify meaning as opposed to denotation relations. Okay, so at the end of his book, Frances says, look, one of the open questions is how to give a proof theoretic semantics for atomic sentences. You can give them for the logical operators because the logical operators have introduction and elimination rules. And then you can specify the meaning of logically complex sentences in terms of the sets of derivations that end in the introduction rule for the major operator. And notice this is a hyper-intentional semantics in the sense that the meaning of A, understood as the set of derivations that end with an introduction rule for the logical operator of A, is going to be different than the set of derivations that end in A and A. Because A and A is going to be the set of derivations that end with and introduction. The set of derivations that end in A is going to be a different set. So it's hyper-intentional, but it's comprehensional, it's connotation. Okay, so on the basis of Frances' claim here, what I've done is I've used the explanatory proof system that Jared Milson, Mark Risjord, and Kareem Khalifa have developed as a basis for interpreting the semantic values of atomic sentences. Here's the idea. Explanations to a claim function as introduction rules. Explanations from a claim specify as elimination rules. So this specifies part of the proof theoretic meaning of atomic sentences and so fixes at least partly an intended interpretation for specific derivation sentences for their atomic sentences. And so the idea is I understand at least part of what Socrates exists means insofar as I can tell you what explains the truth of that claim, or what the truth of that claim explains. Okay, so Kit Fine has given this analysis of, Kit Fine in the 90s points out that Socrates and the singleton set Socrates existed all in the same possible worlds. As a result, we can't use a possible world semantics to distinguish the asymmetric truth value of Socrates is essential to the singleton set Socrates, which we intuitively think is true, and the singleton set Socrates is essential to Socrates, which we intuitively think is false. Because these things existed all in the same possible worlds, we need something else to give an account of these essentialist claims. So his solution is to go model theoretic. So he uses a meta-language of essence claims, of in virtue of claims, to specify object language interpretations for claims about essences. But if we take the semantic value of a sentence to be given by, of an atomic sentence to be given by the explanations in which it figures, then we can understand an object language claim like Socrates is essential to Socrates as expressing commitment to the goodness of the explanation, the context invariant, maximally sufficient goodness of explanation from the existence of Socrates to the existence of the singleton. But then that just kicks up into the meta language the question of why do we endorse that inference? Why isn't there a good explanation for the existence of the individual on the basis of the existence of the set? And here's where we go pragmatist. Look at the practice of identifying individuating sets. I verify that the set of odd numbers between 3 and 7 inclusive is the same set as the set of prime numbers between 3 and 7 inclusive by verifying that the same objects occur in each set. In the formal mode, by making a list of both names and verifying the same names occur in each list. But to verify the claim that Socrates is the same individual or the same human being as the most famous teacher of Plato, I track human beings and the kind of organism we are. So my claim is that just ordinary practices of explanation concerning things like sets and organisms suffice to interpret object language claims of essences as expressing commitment to explanations in a meta language where essentialist vocabulary is mentioned but not used. So we don't need a model theoretic realist meta language of essences. We don't have to inflate our ontology with things like essences or impossible worlds. We just see claims like this as playing a complementary role in understanding sentences, a comprehensional or connotational role. Okay, now consider Doc's interpretation of Sellers. What would Doc Sellers say if asked, why ought we A and C? According to Doc, he'd say, because commitment to the we intention, we shall A and C is implied by the we intention, we shall promote their general welfare. That's to say, there's a good explanation for the ought claim on the basis of the implication relation between the shared intentions. But if we understand object language modal claims as expressing commitment to these explanations, then that's a way of reading that metalinguistic interpretation as giving the proof theoretic semantic values of the moral ought. Now, this is neutral on any particular interpretation of modal claims. If you were a virtue theorist or an ethics of care, you would give a different explanation in the meta language. I'm not interested in specifying which explanations are right. I'm just showing that insofar as you're committed to an idea of an explanation here, you can specify the object language claim in terms of that metalinguistic explanation. So it's possible then that a claim like one ought to A and C is at once a direct exercise of one's practical rationality in terms of putting yourself into the perspective of anyone in the relevant community and exercising your practical cognition from their points of view, and an indirect, that is, has a denotational meaning, and an indirect expression of a grasp of meaning in claims of in terms about what explains it. So the idea then is that the model theory accounts for the world involving extensional content, and the proof theory accounts for the inferential content. Okay, I've got 5 minutes, and I want to finish by looking at this second element of a proof of concept, because so this is all stuff that I've basically finished at this point. I feel like I'm pretty confident about where things are at. But Dave Beiseker has been hammering on me for years to get into bilateral semantics. And it's really one of the things that I found really interesting about how this conference came together is how many people are looking at bilateral semantics and looking at dialogical accounts of reasoning. And this is where I'm out on the edge. I'm not sure what to think of it. So this is work in progress. Okay, but there is this growing research in dialogical accounts of reasoning, the idea that rationality involves practices of giving and asking for reasons. And on such views, human cognition is phylogenetically and ontogenetically scaffolded by practices of social argumentation. So here's the bilateral's key idea. The speech act of asserting A expresses an attitude of assent to A. The speech act of denying or rejecting A expresses an attitude of dissent from A. And then you can give an account of one's grasp of logically complex sentences in terms of one's ability to use these attitudes in the right kinds of combinations. So you can reduce your grasp of logical complexity to your ability to adopt the right kinds of attitudes. So the speech act of asserting A expresses an attitude of dissent from A, and then the speech act of asserting the conditional if A then B expresses an attitude of dissenting from assenting to A and dissenting from B. So with a conditional and negation, you can get all of Boolean logic. So you've got Boolean logic here with just attitudes. Yeah, and you can do it in terms of commitment for the brand domain. Okay, so we reduce logically complex sentences to these simpler attitudes of assertion and rejection. Now, bilateralism adopts a speech act of denial or linguistic rejection. There's no settled terminology here. There's a distinction between the speech act and the attitude. Sometimes rejection is used to label the attitude, and then speech act is denial. I'm going to use linguistic rejection for the speech act, and then dissent for the attitude. So the bilateralist adopts a speech act of linguistic rejection as an explanatory primitive. Now, this speech act involves an attitude directed at language or propositions. Hyperstate semantics in the model theory adopts a mental act of agentive rejection as an explanatory primitive, but that is an attitude directed at choices the agent might make. It's a self-directed attitude operating in the side of volition, not a mental state directed at mental states, contents of mental states. So here's a proposal that might seem promising. Bilateralism is made possible with a special use of single-mindedness. One is rejecting choices concerning speech acts by binding oneself to the corresponding patterns of assent and dissent. But there's a problem with that because we're faced with an inconsistent triad based on what I've argued up to this point. So remember the point about stick beating and flock tending. You could get a language community without there yet being deontic cognition. So we have an inconsistent triad. At most, two of these three claims can be true. Human language use is ontologically prior to deontic cognition in the human species. That was the stick beating and flock tending argument. Deontic cognition in the human species, manifest in agentive rejection, is ontologically prior to the appearance of linguistic rejection in the human species. That's the idea that deontic cognition is the kind of thing that can be manifest in this attitude of single-mindedness. And the third claim is that there's no linguistic community where there's no linguistic rejection. Now, the third is just foundational for bilateralism. And it seems like this number one might be the one to reject. Maybe you can't actually get a language insofar as you've only got shared intentional positive and negative reinforcement practices. But here, I think if we make a distinction, and if we follow the dialogical accounts of reasoning, and in particular, an argument that Katerina Dutil-Novaes put forth in her book on the dialogical roots of deduction, there's a way of resolving this issue. So if we think of human cognition as having its origin in conversation, where different people adopt different points of view in the conversation, and maybe even adopt the points of view of other people, hypothetically, just to see what they can derive. Well, think about what Dutil-Novaes argues in her book. So she looks at deduction as having its roots in dialogical interchange, where there's a prover and skeptic dialogue. Now, up through the Middle Ages in the medieval schools, this is explicit. There's a prover and a skeptic. There's one person adopting one side and another adopting the other. She argues that this gradually gets internalized to the point where people in, say, early 20th century mathematical practice are just adopting both roles themselves before they publish their finished proof. So my proposal then is that maybe the primordial language game was bilateralist, but the perspectives of assertion and denial, or linguistic rejection, were not yet entertained in a single act of cognition. They were always only apportioned separately, in much the way this prover-skeptic dialogues might have been. And the idea would be that different people played the roles of asserter and denier at different points by keeping score on each other, without being capable of self-reflectively keeping score on themselves as individuals by recognizing that to assert a negation is to deny the negate, or to assert a conditional is to deny asserting the antecedent and denying the consequent. So they weren't yet able to do that internally, but they could keep track of that across perspectives. So if the former then is a kind of non-discursive linguistic rejection, the latter is a discursive linguistic rejection. And then the idea is that discursive cognition involves a single act of cognition that tracks both what one does and classes of choice incompatible with what one does. And then the first properly rational thought was an act of self-consciousness, an act of thought thinking itself and holding these two attitudes together in one act of cognition. And so this then is the final view. So the idea would be that we interpose another stage here. Prior to agentive rejection and deontic cognition, which in a linguistic culture allows you to get autonomy, an autonomous language game that ultimately will count as discursive. You have a non-discursive linguistic rejection that's heteronymous in the sense that no individual is entertaining these things together, binding themselves to a course of action. They're instead doing it across perspectives. So that's basically it. I've used considerations in modal logic to try to give a more precise account of human rationality. I've argued that it's compatible with views in the sciences. I think the logic itself makes interesting suggestions. It looks like these things are more or less borne out. Yeah, so my hope is that it is something like a science of logic that opens up into a philosophy of nature and a philosophy of spirit, but in a way where that's not mysterious and it's relevant for both philosophers and for scientists. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Preston. Whoa. I was interested in the fine bit, and in particular, so the way I always read the fine stuff on Socrates, I thought that it's in some sense a reinvention of something that Geach said a long time ago. So what Geach said was that the deontic modal operator has to be, as it were, indexed to an agent, because Geach thought it can be the case that you ought to take me out to dinner without being the case that I ought to be taken out to dinner by you. But there's just one proposition here. If we think that, you know, throwing something into the passive voice doesn't change the proposition expressed, then there's just one proposition here. And so, but that means that you have to index, as it were, the ought to one of the agents. There's the proposition Preston is taking Ulf out to dinner, and then there's a question where to explore whose obligation is the whole thing. And the essences in Socrates can be thought of in a similar way, right? There's just this one sentence, I don't know, Socrates and a single Socrates coexist maybe in every possible world together. And then the question is, well, who is responsible? Is it Socrates or is it single Socrates? Now you have a story about Socrates and singleton Socrates. I would like to have a story about the Socrates case and about the dinner case that treat them as parallel, because the two cases look parallel to me.
Yeah, so I guess I don't share your desire in that. Sorry, did you finish your question? Or?
I was just wondering whether it fits into your account to have it's the story that you tell about Socrates, whether that could be applied to the deontic modal case as well.
Well, so my view about this stuff is that I think we need to, so there's an urge that philosophers and linguists and logicians can have is systematicity and simplicity. So take the Kratzer semantics for like any modal, right? Incredibly powerful, incredibly simple, right? A simple resource, you've got a modal source, you've got ordering on possible worlds, and then you can distinguish claims about what ought to be qua organism, what ought to be qua instrumental good, what ought to be qua morality. And I'm resistant to the claim that we should think of these things as all performing a common function. So I'm not inclined to think that a claim like you ought to, like it ought to be qua Preston that Ulf is taken out for dinner should given, I mean, I'm inclined to think there might be something to that, but I'm not inclined to think that the account one gives of essentialist vocabulary is going to look anything like that. I mean, you know, you've read the essay. So, you know, the term itself comes as a nominalization of the Latin copula as a way to talk about Aristotle's metaphysics in Latin. And the idea that, and then, but it turns out we use it all the time naturally, right? Like he was being essentially belligerent all dinner, or when a team without a running game has only one quarterback who gets hurt, then the game is essentially over. So that's the kind of systematicity I'd like to be able to go for a single lexical item. Let's be able to make sense of the ways we use it. But then the idea that all of these modals are going to be given one interpretation, I just don't share. That's not a desire I have.
Okay, thanks.
We still have time. So I'll ask as well. You said at the beginning of the talk that choosing single-mindedly means rejecting any incompatible actions.
Yeah.
What does it mean from the perspective of some of, let's say, here that is part of the conversation, and someone will say, "I'll be at the conference." So what kind of processing must be there when processing this utterance for the hearer? Is that something that the hearer should be should be aware of?
I don't know about the processing, whether it should be aware of. So here would be, let me try to give an answer and see if this touches base with what you're asking. So suppose it wouldn't just be the will, because the will is the temporal modal, and that's going to be done in terms of possible worlds. So think about a claim like, I ought to call my mother this evening. In a context in which I understand why you say that, or even just that you say it, on my account, that understanding on its model theoretic side involves my putting myself into your point of view and thinking about what I would do if it was my mother, or maybe what I would do if I was you, thinking about your mother. So I'm open to the possibility that we need to track that distinction too. So that would be my account of the kind of processing at the level of model theory. But then when it comes to proof theory, I'm going to want to say, well, I've got to have some explanation for why it's the case that he thinks he ought to call his mother. And maybe then I don't know, like I don't know anything about your background. But insofar as I can put myself affectively, volitionally into your point of view, the processing occurs in virtue of doing that.
Okay. Maybe I'm seeing this from a different perspective. Like
Okay.
when someone say, I will be at the conference, then
I ought to. If we're going to use the deontic,
Okay.
let's use the deontic.
I ought to be at the conference. Then from the perspective of linguistic processing, you process particular words, and then you and the outcome of semantic processing is something like the meaning of a sentence, and then you can use the meaning of a sentence in some kind of pragmatic processes. So I wonder whether these rejection of incompatibilities, whether this is part of the semantic processing of ought, or whether this is something you infer on top of that.
Oh, okay, I see. Well, no, my claim is that it's part of the semantic processing of ought, that insofar as you understand the claim that one ought to do something, you are putting yourself into a perspective where you're rejecting everything incompatible with it. So that the understanding of ought requires that notion of rejection as part of what you're entertaining as you're thinking.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
It's going to have to be quick, Dave. It's going to have to be quick. We got 1 minute and a bunch of Czech beer that needs to get done.
All right, well, I just wanted you to, I was going to invite you to describe that middle layer. I mean, what are those creatures like? What are they doing? And can you relate that to the very last section of mental events where Sellers himself introduces a notion of rejection in order to get his representing creatures over the hump from what he calls Humean systems to Aristotelian representational systems.
Thank you. So I appreciate that you invited me to expand on it. I should have invited you all to criticize me on it, because that's where I feel like the work needs to be done. I'm not confident about this. It just seems to me this is a way of preserving the view up to this point, to take a sort of dialogical account of bilateralism as a stage, not just in the history of the development of deduction, but in the phylogeny of human cognition. Now, yeah, Sellers stuff at the end of mental events, that's in the background, the difference between Humean representational systems where they ape reason, but they don't in their mental processing have conditionals or negations. He suggests that you might get from the Humean to the Aristotelian system with conditionals and negations in terms of reflections on the subjunctive stability of your own mental states, and then rejection as a kind of attitude. So I don't know. I mean, this is, to be honest, I'm not even sure that the idea of a dialogical or a bifurcated notion of bilateral semantics makes sense. I don't know that you could have an assertion that is a negation, but it's only in virtue of someone else tracking the denial that it counts as a negation. I'm not sure.
Well, aren't you heartened by the fact that that's where Sellers begins to go bilateral?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know enough about the bilateral stuff to know that that's what Sellers is doing. But I do think that, as I said, I think that there's something like a confluence of research around these issues, and I find that heartening. I can't say that I see where it's going, but it looks like there's a collective here that's going somewhere, and that I'm excited by. Thank you.